Hello, and welcome to Tech 5, 5 technology stories that I think you should know about. Who am I? I'm Sean Thuris, a software developer in the San Francisco Bay Area, where I run a small technology consultancy. Story number 1. Unity buys Weta Digital. Somehow this had escaped my notice, but Peter Jackson's special effects house, Weta Digital, was just purchased by Unity, a company that produces a game engine that's used in a number of video games. So here's Unity. They rose to prominence because they made it easy to develop games for the iPhone back in 2008-9. Originally, Unity was only available on the Mac, and then later it was ported over to Windows, and I believe you can use it on Linux as well now. A few of the games that have been made with Unity include Escape from Tarkov, Hollow Knight, and Cuphead. And here I realize I should explain what a game engine is. It's a piece of software that allows you to focus on the design and the gameplay of your game rather than having to do things like simulate physics or simulate collisions between objects and so on. There's a lot more to it than that, but that's the basic idea. So Peter Jackson said, interestingly, that he saw Jurassic Park and he realized that that was going to be the future of movies, that CGI was going to be very important. So he created a scene in his movie Heavenly Creatures, which is misspelled here, that would use CGI, even though there was really no need to include this in the movie. But he just wanted his team to have a chance to start working on CGI. They bought one computer, they had one person on the team who knew how to use it. And then the next movie he did was The Frighteners. He said they went from one computer to 30 computers. And then, of course, Lord of the Rings, the effects there were quite involved, and they built up this Weta Digital studio for that. I remember seeing some really interesting behind-the-scenes footage about how it was necessary for them to establish a high-speed link between London, where their composer was, and New Zealand, where they were doing the production. He says the version of Gollum that's visible very briefly in The Fellowship, it looks like this,
pretty gnarly, pretty crude. It was as good as we could do at that time.
Ended up looking very different from the finished version. And the reason that they made this scene so dark is that he thought their Gollum model looked terrible, and he didn't want people to look at it too closely. And so now Unity has bought Weta. Unity has a business model where they make most of their software available for free and then charge for profit-making uses of it. So, for example, if someone wants to make something, they can make a very elaborate thing, but if they want to charge money for it and they end up making, say, more than $100,000 per year or month, I forget what the licensing is, then they have to pay Unity significantly more than nothing. Anyway, this one came out of nowhere for me, and I thought it was pretty interesting. Story number 2. Fusion in Korea. Like many other countries, Korea has their own nuclear fusion project going on. And just a quick review, energy derived from nuclear fusion is considered to be safer on the whole than energy derived from nuclear fission, because fusion has fewer opportunities for runaway reactions the way fission does, and also the byproducts, generally speaking, are less dangerous in themselves. So the K-Star facility was built in 2007, and like most fusion projects, they keep tinkering with it over time, not only making adjustments to it, but actually adding hardware to it. And the reason for this story is that they've succeeded in confining very hot plasma for longer than any other facility has done. They managed to heat the plasma to more than 100 million degrees centigrade and kept it there for 1.5 seconds. And the reason that it's difficult to contain it is that the plasma has to be kept under some kind of pressure. So inside a star, it's kept under gravitational pressure, all of the star pushing in on itself. So these reactions are confined and can't just fly apart. Another way to do it is through inertial confinement, and that's what happens inside a nuclear weapon. There's an explosion that pushes in or fires a projectile into a mass. Or what's being done in all of these tokamak reactors is that there's a torus, a donut, that's confining it with magnetism. And here the Department of Energy has a photo of some plasma being confined. Anyway, this Korean facility was able to confine the 100 million degree plasma for 30 seconds. They're hoping to do it for 300 seconds. Of course, if you want to have ongoing production of electricity from a reactor, you have to keep the plasma confined indefinitely, unless you're using a pulsed technology. And I think there are at least a few of those where the energy is derived from the plasma in bursts. So it's confined, it gives off a certain amount of energy, and then there's a recovery time, and then it goes again. Story number 3, researchers at Stanford found out something about whales and the ocean. You would assume that because baleen whales consume krill for their diet, and humans killed off 1.5 million of them in the mid-20th century, that there would now be more krill. But in fact, it turns out that's not the case. These researchers from Stanford tagged the whales, observed their behavior, saw how much they were eating. They discovered that whales require more krill than we previously thought by a factor of 2 or 3, that they eat maybe less fish than we thought. Those whales that eat fish eat less fish than we thought, and those whales that depend on krill eat more krill than we thought. And it turns out that the waste that whales produce, whale poop, contains iron and other materials that are actually necessary for krill to live. And this generally happens in the Southern Ocean. It looks a little something like this. So the Southern Ocean is just everything around Antarctica. And sneak peek to next week, we have another Southern Ocean Antarctica story. Shh. They have a chart here that at first I thought looked very intimidating, and then I realized it's just a whale going up to the surface to breathe, coming down, bobbing up and down for krill, and then going back to breathe again. And, maybe there's a lesson in that when you're confronted with something that looks confusing or an elaborate diagram or something. If you take a few seconds, maybe it'll just become obvious to you. Or maybe, like me, you'll think it's obvious and you actually don't know what you're looking at. But you'll feel like you do. Story number 4, and this is a fun one. Apple was having bad reviews of its podcast app, and they did something about it. And now the reviews are good. So Apple Podcasts went from having 1.8 stars on the App Store to 4.6 stars in a month. How is this possible? They must have introduced a really great update to the app and fixed the problems that people had been complaining about. Well, no. No, in fact, they introduced a prompt to rate the app that appears after someone has finished listening to a podcast. How could that go wrong? Well, it looks like the top review on the store at the moment is best podcast ever. I'm glad my friend introduced me to this podcast. That doesn't sound like a review of the podcast app. And then you see some more examples here that show this is exactly what's happening. People are giving good reviews to the podcasts they're listening to on the app, but those reviews are actually being submitted in the context of the app in the App Store. This might qualify as one of those dark patterns that you hear about in manipulative interactions between apps and people, or maybe it was an honest mistake. Story number 5, Intel is out with some new chips that are really new. Just very quickly, I know that discussing CPUs is not to everyone's taste. And speaking of that, Please let me know what you do want me to talk about. Please let me know if there's a story that you'd like me to cover. Please let me know if I'm covering too many of the basics. I want to know who's watching. I want to know what you want to know. So the 12th generation of Intel's core processors is very different from the previous ones because instead of having a number of cores that all behave approximately the same with some differences as far as the frequencies that they can reliably operate at, which may vary a bit but from core to core, just due to imperfections in manufacturing. Instead of that, they've now developed this performance cores and efficiency cores. So this makes the job of the operating system a bit more difficult because between the operating system and the chip, they have to decide which tasks should be sent to which cores. So if there are some easy tasks or background tasks, those should go to the efficiency cores that are based on a slightly older technology that also uses less electricity and generates less heat. And then the foreground tasks will go to the performance cores. I promised that I wouldn't go into too much depth on this. Here's a measure of a common benchmark, which is handbrake, video transcoding. And it shows that the top AMD Ryzen chip is only very slightly faster than this new 12th generation Intel chip. And it also shows that the Intel chip uses 239 watts, where the Ryzen series use somewhere in the mid 100s. The chip that I'm using is around this level. It's around 80 watts. Anyway, this is something that Apple has done as well with their M1 chips. They have this ability to use the fast cores and the slow cores, essentially, the high power cores and the low power cores. And this is something that will be useful in the future as computers handle a lot of background tasks that don't need to be prioritized that way and don't need to use a lot of power. Well, thanks for joining me. I hope you enjoyed it. If you or someone you know needs help with technology, whether a website, audio-visual, or just general direction in terms of what technology to choose for some business need, for example, I can help with cloud costs and so on. Thanks for sitting through the commercial this time, and I'll see you next time.